The town of Bell River never asked for trouble. It was the kind of place where secrets grew like ivy, and Sundays meant two things: silence and scripture. In 1879, there stood a modest, whitewashed church nestled in the cradle between two fog-kissed hills, just a few horse rides east of the main square. It was called St. Adalbert's of the Valley, and it was more than just a building, it was a rhythm. Every Sunday morning, just as the dew slipped off the iron fence and the rooster's crow was answered by the tolling of the church bell, 50 children would wind their way up the path like a living hymn, pressed into hand-me-down coats and carrying small leather Bibles stitched with names worn thin. Some skipped, some dragged their feet, but all arrived under the same ancient roof, drawn to the warmth of the fireplace and the cinnamon scent from Miss Leela's pantry next door. The bell rang at 8 a.m. sharp. They were seen entering the church, and that was the last time anyone in Bell River ever saw them again. At first, it wasn't panic. The fog was thick that day, like clotted milk, rolling in from the lowlands with a stubborn presence that silenced even the blue jays. Parents assumed the service ran long, or the children had stayed back for scripture recitation or a rehearsal. But by noon, the sun had failed to break through. By 2:00, a few uneasy fathers rode down to the church, only to find the doors closed, the windows unshuttered, and no laughter or footfalls within. By 4:00, the entire town stood outside St. Adalbert's, mothers holding each other's hands tight, men loading their shotguns out of instinct, and old Miss Leela weeping into a gingham cloth, whispering, "They were just babes, just little ones." Sheriff Mathers arrived by sundown now, and kicked the double oak doors in with a fury not often seen in Bell River. What he found stopped even the crows in the steeple from calling. Inside, the pews were untouched. A warm fire still glowed in the hearth as if it had been fed recently, and the Bibles, all 50, sat neatly on the benches, each opened to Psalm 23. But there were no children. No scuff marks on the floor. No panicked scratchings. No overturned chairs. Nothing but 50 small coats still hanging neatly on the pegs lining the entryway. Each one dry pristine, waiting as though their owners might return at any moment to slip them on. Sheriff Mathers called for dogs, lanterns, and every able-bodied man in the county. For 2 nights straight, they scoured the surrounding woods, hills, and even the old mine shaft that had long since been boarded up past Crow Ridge. But there were no footprints in the mud, no broken branches, no scent for the bloodhounds to track. It was as if the children had simply ceased, erased, not taken. The preacher, Father Elgin Meredith, was found the next morning sitting outside the church, barefoot, holding an unlit candle in one hand and muttering, "I only stepped away for a moment, just to fetch the light." He was questioned, pressed, even jailed briefly, but he offered no other answers, only trembling and prayers in Latin. The town grew dark, not just in grief, but in spirit. No one entered the church again. Its doors were nailed shut with rusted iron spikes. Parents left toys out on their porches for weeks, as if a wagon of returning souls might roll back through a town. But weeks turned into months, and soon people stopped speaking the names of the missing, because they feared what might answer back. Stories grew like fungus. Some said the hill itself had swallowed them. Others whispered about a black carriage seen by the cemetery that morning, pulled by horses whose hooves made no sound. Still others recalled an old tale from the original settlers about a clearing in the fog where voices rise but bodies done. Follow? But no one dared go looking. Not after what happened to Reuben Cade, the gravedigger's apprentice who ventured into the woods with his older brother 2 months after the incident, determined to find their bones or find the devil. His brother returned screaming, soaked in blood, insisting Reuben had been snatched into the earth by mouths that didn't blink. His hair turned white before the year was out. The town began to wither under the weight of its silence. St. Adalbert's stood like a ghost, unburned but abandoned, its bell never rung again, its doors trembling in the wind like teeth in a dreaming mouth. The event was never recorded in newspapers, strangely omitted or erased. Records vanished from the county clerk's office. Census logs from 1879 show no children in Bell River that year, though families still held the empty clothes and portraits of the lost. And then came the dreams, shared, eerily similar visions recounted in hushed tones at the general store and over fences, dreams of a church filled with fog, pews occupied by shadowed children, humming a song no one could name, always ending with the turning of 50 heads in unison. No faces, only hollow ovals where eyes should be, and that same voice whispering in dozens of throats, "We didn't leave. We were invited." In 1881, a visiting missionary from Virginia attempted to hold a service in the old church. He made it as far as the threshold before collapsing, screaming of cold voices brushing past him like wind in the bones. He left that same night, and no preacher has tried since. As in decades past, new children were born, but no one dared restart Sunday school. The event became a wound sealed under layers of denial, whispered only after strong drink or in the restless hour before dawn. The forest swallowed the back trail to the church, and ivy cracked the steeple stone. Yet somehow the coats still remained inside, seen once by a drunkard who peered through the broken side window in 1906. He claimed they looked freshly pressed, clean, as if someone had been caring for them, or waiting. By 1910, those who remembered the vanishing were mostly gone, taken by age, or by whatever strange sorrow hung heavy over Bell River like a fog that would never lift. But a few letters survived, hidden in attics, tucked between pages of family Bibles. One, written by a grieving father, read, "They never screamed. That's the part I cannot bear. 50 children, and not one scream. What kind of silence steals the young?" And another, unsigned, possibly from Father Mareth himself, found beneath the floorboards in the rectory. The candles were not for light. They were to hold it back. But I failed. I stepped away. And now they sing in the hush where God does not listen. The rest is silence. But if you go to Bell River today, ask the oldest farmer you can find about the church. Watch his face. And wait. You may not get an answer, but you may hear, just beneath the wind, if it's Sunday, if it's foggy, the faint rustle of tiny coats, and the hush of 50 footsteps never heard again. If Chapter 1 was the vanishing, then Chapter 2 was the unraveling, And it began with the man who had once stood at the pulpit with steady hands and a voice like calm water. Father Elgin Mareth. He had been Belle River's spiritual anchor for nearly 2 decades, arriving young, orphaned by war, and clutching only a single box of possessions. Inside it, the now infamous leather-bound book he never let out of his sight. At first, he was respected, even adored by the devout who appreciated his quiet humility and the way he wept softly during communion. But after the vanishing, after those 50 children evaporated beneath his watch, something inside him began to uncoil like a tight spring finally snapping free. The first change was small. He stopped wearing his collar, muttered to himself even while among others, and began visiting the cemetery at strange hours, placing unmarked stones on graves that had no name. And then came the night he wandered into the tavern barefoot, wild-eyed, asking if anyone had seen the lambs under the floorboards, and whispering that the light we trust is not his light. He was escorted out, gently, by Sheriff Mathers, who by then had become more caretaker than lawman to the preacher whose mind appeared to be splintering. But the strange incidents escalated. One morning, the townspeople found that the church bell had rung by itself at 3:33 a.m., a time some said was the devil's mirror, and Mareth was found in the steeple, arms outstretched in crucifixion pose, mumbling fragments of nursery rhymes. And then there was the book. Bound in cracked black leather, its edges stained a deep brown that looked far too organic, the tome was Mareth's constant companion. He never quoted scripture directly, always referring instead to pages he'd copied down into this other text, handwritten, filled with sigils no one recognized, lines crossed out and rewritten over and over again in a language that danced just beyond familiarity. He called it the Shepherd's Code, and claimed it had been passed down from his great-grandfather, who had once fled a congregation in Europe after the sky cracked open and began whispering back. Nobody in town had seen the book's full contents until the night of the floorboards. That night began with a strange odor coming from the church, sweet, rotting, like decaying honey. Sheriff Mathers and 2 deputies forced their way in, fearing Mareth had hurt himself. They didn't find him at first. Instead, what they discovered changed everything. The pulpit had been dragged aside, revealing a crawlspace beneath the altar, one no one in the town's history had ever mentioned, including the architects whose dusty blueprints were later consulted in disbelief. The hatch was old, iron, etched with symbols they couldn't name, circles within circles, a child's open mouth, and something that looked eerily like a reversed cross drawn upside down but dripping. Inside the chamber was a stone slab no wider than a crib mattress, carved into eye. The floor, surrounded by candlesticks, melted into puddles. On the slab, drawn in a kind of soot or ash, were dozens of tiny faces, each face hand-drawn on parchment, nailed to the stone with thin iron pins. Each face had blank eyes, hollow circles, no irises, no pupils, just the impression of childhood features fading into nothingness. And beneath the slab, someone had scrawled the phrase, "They are not gone, mem, they are claimed." It was then that Father Mareth reappeared, his hands covered in soot, clutching the book tight to his chest, whispering, "You opened it. Now you've heard them too." He was arrested that night, placed in the sheriff's home for holding, but he didn't sleep. Witnesses said he sat upright until dawn, eyes wide, murmuring in tongues and smiling at the corners of the room no one else could bear to look at. And then, just before morning, he was gone. The front door still locked, no footprints in the dew, just the book left on the table, and one message burned into the mirror with a finger dipped in candle wax. He never called them children. That was the last time anyone saw Father Mareth. Search parties were formed. The river was dredged, but nothing. And then the book. Ah, yes, the book. That cursed thing. Sheriff Mathers tried to hand it over to the state, but no official would take it. Instead, it was passed between townsfolk like a plague, each reader swearing they heard something, not with their ears, but inside their minds. Some claimed to dream of the missing children, standing still in a burning field, eyes stitched shut, singing in a language that peeled the skin from the listener's thoughts. Others saw their own children vanish in dreams, only to wake up screaming and find their child whispering Mareth's name in their sleep. The book was eventually locked in the town hall's basement vault, but by then it had already left its mark. Miss Leela, who had run the church's Sunday school for 30 years, went blind overnight after reading just 4 pages. Her final words before being institutionalized were, "They're in the in-between. They're watching who replaces them." The next reader, a local school teacher, tried to burn the book, only for the fire to go out the moment it touched the pages. When she finally lit it using kerosene, the flames turned blue and whispered her name until she collapsed and lost her hearing. The book survived. The town council voted to bury it, and 3 men took it into the woods in a sealed iron box. Only 2 returned, gray-faced and trembling. They never spoke again. The third, Thomas Brigg, was found weeks later in his barn, crucified upside down, a child's shoelace wrapped around each finger. On his chest was carved the word, "Return." Back in the church crawl space, more symbols began to appear, etched into the wood, seemingly overnight. Strange figures, like children with no mouths, holding hands in circles. Animals in reverse. Wolves with sheep's eyes, lambs with fangs. A visiting linguist from Boston in 1882 tried to decipher the markings, and concluded they resembled no known language, but bore similarities to early Aramaic and pre-Christian pagan inscriptions found in caves near the Black Sea. His final report was mailed back to Harvard but never arrived. He disappeared en route. All that was ever recovered was his sketchbook, filled with eyes, hundreds of them, wide, blank, watching. Even those who never read the book but lived in Bell River felt the shift. Babies were born without cries. The town clock began to stall at 3:33. Birds stopped nesting on the church's steeple. And on certain nights, under a gibbous moon, dogs would whimper and hide under porches, while the air thickened with a smell like burnt milk and old pine. Mareth's personal letters, later discovered hidden inside his chimney, revealed something far worse. They weren't sermons, they were confessions. In them, he wrote about being chosen, about listening long enough to be heard back, and about the door beneath the altar that only opened if the songs were sung backward. One letter included a list of names, 50 to be exact. Each name matched a child lost on that Sunday. But beside each was a date, not of birth, but expiration. All dates matched the vanishing. But in the margins of the letter, in newer ink, were additional names. Children not yet born, predicted, seemingly, by someone who claimed to see the threads before they knot. Some of those children were born in Bell River years later. Most died before age 5. A few left town. All reported dreams of a place with no ceiling, no floor, only echoes of children humming in the dark. As for the town itself, it became a place of wary eyes and bolted doors. The church was chained shut, and eventually a black iron fence was erected around it, though no one admitted who paid for it. No official records mention Mareth past 1880. His name was struck from the county's rolls, but the book remained. And those who claimed to have seen its pages, truly seen them, said they changed. That the ink moved. That sometimes, just for a second, the reader saw their own name written there, fading quickly like breath on glass. And that when that happened, the whispers didn't stop after the book was closed. They only got louder. By 1903, St. Adalbert's Church was no longer just a sealed building. It was a legend twisted into the marrow of Bell River's identity, an abscess no one dared lance, a memory buried in public silence but passed from mouth to ear behind locked doors and under gaslight. Over 2 decades had passed since the vanishing, and though the church's doors had long since been sealed with iron nails and surrounded by rusting chains, the earth beneath it never quite settled. Grass refused to grow within 20 feet of the chapel's stone threshold, and birds veered away from the steeple's black cross as if avoiding a wound in the sky. Those who had lived nearby swore they could feel it, some pressure in the bones, as if the air grew heavier with each step closer, like wading into water that never touched the skin but chilled the soul. It was the kind of place children were dared to run past at night, and old men crossed themselves beside without knowing why. And yet, it was in the dead summer of 1922, heat clinging to the skin like wet cotton and cicadas screaming louder than sense, that 4 teenage boys, drunk on beer and bravado, decided to break the last rule the town had left sacred. They would enter St. Adalbert's. Their names were Marcus Dill, Jethro Keene, Thomas Willings, and Simon Gray, the latter being the youngest, barely 13, a wiry boy with pale eyes and a stutter that made even his name sound like an echo. They came armed with crowbars, lanterns, and a dare etched into whiskey-laced laughter. By sundown, 3 would be gone. The 4th would never speak again. According to the testimony of an old man who'd once been Sheriff Mather's deputy, the boys broke the church's seal just after 3 p.m., and neighbors reported hearing the bell toll 3 times, though the rope had long since been cut and no wind stirred the valley. What exactly they encountered inside is still debated, but Simon Gray was found the next morning lying just outside the chained gate, barefoot, blood crusted around his ears and mouth, clutching a small, tattered child's shoe in both hands, a shoe far too old to belong to anyone living. His hair had turned bone white, and though his eyes tracked movement, he never spoke again, never wrote, never smiled. He lived for 12 more years in the Bell River home for the unwell, drawing the same shape in charcoal every day, a perfect circle, with no beginning or end, surrounded by 50 tiny marks like teeth. Every night, nurses claimed he would wake screaming, not loud, but breathy and broken, a choking sound like something trying to escape not from his lungs but from his memory. He died in 1904 after slicing his fingers open on a mirror in his room. The blood he wrote with Smith, airing his final words in jagged red letters, simply read, "They hum when no one listens." That year, the town put a fence around the church. Black iron spikes, taller than a man, tipped with rust and rumor. And still, people swore that if you passed too close on fog-thick mornings, especially Sundays, you could hear laughter, soft and breathy, the kind that made your spine stiffen because it wasn't laughter meant for joy. It was play without playfulness, mirth without warmth. The sound children might make if they'd forgotten what it meant to be held. The church was never demolished. No contractor stayed longer than a day. Every demolition company hired sent back a cancellation without explanation. One foreman went blind overnight. Another threw himself down a well, clutching an empty photo frame. The town eventually stopped trying, hoping the forest would swallow the thing. It didn't. Instead, strange patterns began to form in the soil. Rings of dead grass around the building, like crop circles too precise to be random. Trees leaned away from the structure as if pulled backward by some silent gravity. In 1964, nearly a century after the vanishing, a woman from Boston named Dr. Marion Holloway arrived in Bell River. She was an archivist and historian specializing in anomalous disappearances and folk rituals. Part scholar, part spiritual detective. She had heard whispers of the church from a man in a hospice who wept whenever he heard hymns. With credentials from Miskatonic University and a spine made of stone, she came to Bell River with intent, to open the past and let the truth bleed through. At first, the town ignored her. Then they warned her. Then, just before she made her first official request to access the church grounds, someone, or something, broke into her hotel room, leaving no sign of forced entry, no items missing except one, her crucifix necklace. In its place, Lai, Nang, on her pillow, was a dried corn husk doll with a missing eye and a red string around its neck. Undeterred, she pressed on, and after digging into the town's dusty cemetery records, she made a discovery that rattled even her. There were 50 gravestones without names, simply marked "Child" and dated 1809. No records of burial, no known parents, no death certificates. But worse, when she compared the physical graves to the official maps, she realized something terrifying. There were Satwan headstones, but 72 graves, 11 bodies with no stones, or 22 stones with no bodies. Nothing matched. And then she found the real horror. Beneath a pile of unfiled documents in the church's old storage barn, she uncovered a map of the original building plan. It was clear and explicit. St. Adalbert's had no subfloor, no chamber, no crawlspace. Yet eyewitness accounts from 1879 through 1922 all described a stone altar chamber beneath the pulpit. Either it had been added in secret, or it had never been part of the church at all. The next day, Dr. Holloway vanished. Her hotel room undisturbed, her car still in the lot. The cornhusk doll returned to her nightstand, this time with both eyes missing. Her journal was found beside the church gate. One sentence written in jagged ink. It hears memory. After that, Bell River closed itself off. No more inquiries, No more investigations. In 1905, a rare storm washed away some of the church's foundation, revealing a portion of the old altar room. Locals who peeked in described the same soot-smeared walls, the stone slab, the pinned drawings of children. But this time, there were new drawings, ones that looked eerily like children who currently lived in town. A sheriff's deputy who went inside to collect the sketches came out foaming at the mouth and repeating a single word: replace. He died 2 days later. The drawings were never recovered. In the years since, the church has remained untouched. But whispers continued. Parents reported hearing soft tapping from their attic floors on Sunday nights. Children in school began to draw the round room in art class, and some claimed their little ones spoke of the quiet preacher who walks backward. More than once, the town's only midwife reported births where infants were born humming. Not crying, but humming the exact tune of the Sunday school hymn sung on the day of the vanishing. She left town in 1991. Her replacement lasted 6 months. Today, Bell River appears ordinary, quaint even. The church is hidden by overgrowth, and new families are told little. But the old ones know. And sometimes you can see it in their faces when you mention St. Adalbert's. The tightness around the eyes, the sudden silence, the glance toward the hills. They say that if you approach the church on the first Sunday of October, just before dawn, you might see fog pouring upward from beneath the doors like smoke from a long extinguished fire. And if you're brave or foolish enough to step close, you may hear the faint rustle of coats. You may feel something grip your thoughts. Not your body, not your limbs, but your mind, as if a child's hand reached inside and flicked a light off. And carved on the church's foundation stone, barely visible now, moss-bitten and cracked, the last line anyone ever carved into the town's memory. Let not the voices rise again. But rise they do, every Sunday, in the hush between the hymns, in the silence before the first yawn, in the eyes of children staring too long at empty pews, and in the dreams of anyone who's ever heard a child laugh when they know they're alone.